welcome everybody. Thank you for coming over. And yeah, I was going to say I've spent the whole of conference so far saying thank you for braving the rain, and it's delightful to be able to start by looking out at sunshine. So great to see you all. So we're here this afternoon to talk about how will Labour make their green industrial strategy a reality, and we've got a brilliant panel to talk about that. I figure at this point in conference, the absolutely last thing anybody wants is lengthy introductory remarks from the chair. So I will just say that, hi, my name's Sarah Mulley. I'm IPPR's Director of Policy and Politics, and just move straight to introducing our brilliant panel. I think I'll introduce everybody briefly at the beginning, and then I'll come to Sarah first, and we'll move along in this direction. So delighted to be joined by Sarah Jones, Minister for Industry. Obviously exactly the right person to have here to talk about this today, and thank you for rushing over direct from Keir's speech to be here. And then we'll hear from Sue Ferns, who is Deputy General Secretary of Prospect. Then we will hear from my colleague George Dibb, who is Associate Director of Economic Policy at IPPR. And then last but very much not least, we will hear from Todd Tucker, who is Director for Industrial Policy and Trade at the Roosevelt Institute in DC, who brings really valuable experience, having implemented and experienced a lot of this agenda in the US. So before I forget, really thanks to Prospect for supporting this event, and we're delighted to be working with you on this today. And it really feels like this has been a theme of the whole conference so far. So I think having this conversation about what it's going to mean in kind of practical, real terms to actually see this green industrial strategy be implemented is a really exciting topic for this afternoon. So I'm going to hand straight over to Sarah to speak for a few minutes, and then we'll get all the panel to speak for about 5 minutes each, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So, Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here. What a wonderful room as well to be in. Really, really good venue. Fabulous to see everyone, and I want to hear from the panel in terms of their expertise. We have a new government, so we have a completely new approach. Politics is going to be done differently. We've just heard Keir set out his priorities. I hope you were all listening. And the kind of green industrial strategy is really at the heart of the ambitions that we have around growing the economy and around reaching our target for net zero. So the two driving missions of this government, growing the economy and becoming a net zero superpower, can only happen through the delivery of a green industrial strategy. So it really is front and centre of everything that we will be doing. Why? You will have heard, hopefully, Ed Miliband's speech yesterday. He is very good at articulating an argument as to what we're doing, and I think it's worth sort of setting that out. We all saw with the price hike in energy that we saw at the time of the war in Ukraine, that British people were paying the price for a lack of energy security in this country, and they were paying the price for a failure of government to deliver the energy security that we needed to see. Those rocketing energy bills were very real and very serious, and we need, as a Labour government, to respond to that to make sure it can never happen again. And that is front and centre in what we want to do. So our argument is that Britain was very exposed, was uniquely exposed to many other countries because of the way we rely on fossil fuels. We were left unprepared by the previous government, and that clean energy in the UK is the way to tackle that problem, and that's what we want to do. It is also the way to drive jobs and skills and growth in parts of the country where we need to see it most. So the need for energy security and the need for economic security combine through the green industrial strategy, and accelerating growth at pace is the quickest way, the best way to get to where we want to be. So Ed has been enormously speedy. I say this to many people. When we first got in, the civil servants had to sort of take him aside and say, please, you have to go on holiday, because we are all at a point of breaking, because the speed with which he is demanding change, quite rightly, and they, you know, the department has responded brilliantly, but it is quite a thing. So in DBT, where I sit, as well as DESNAS, I sit in the two departments, we are driving the industrial strategy, and the kind of green energy agenda will be front and centre in that industrial strategy. And then in DESNAS, we're pushing that net zero 2030. We've got Chris Stark, who's going to have his mission control, his war room, whatever you want to call it, where he will have all the data and all the information to drive progress across the country. And we are looking, when we talked about skills with my neighbour many times before in lots of different sectors, but skills has to be at the heart of this strategy, and we've set up the Office for Green Energy Jobs in DESNAS, which I'm going to be leading on with Ed, obviously, leading fundamentally, and that mission is to drive the skills in the right direction that we need for the energies of the future. So we have all the levers, whether it's the National Wealth Fund, whether it's Great British Energy, whether it's the British Jobs Bonus, or whether it's skills, that we think can drive the green industrial strategy and get us where we want to be. So that's the overview, and I'll probably leave it there because other people should speak, but I'm really keen to hear from people in the panel and in the audience on how we get there, what we need to do, you know, what the barriers are, what we need to break down, and what we need to understand as a new government.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think really that's a really interesting question to explore, is kind of where are the barriers, because they sit in all kinds of, you know, it's across government, right? This has to be an effort across the whole of government. So I will hand straight on to Sue to come in. I don't know if you want to pick up some of those points about skills or some of the wider questions.
So really pleased to be having this conversation. Look, green industrial strategy is really important to Prospect, so much so that Sarah was kind enough to join the launch of our report on energising a green industrial strategy before this recess. And this report, I think, goes very much with the grain of Labour thinking. It's a Prospect report, but it's based on inputs from key employers across the industry as well, because there clearly is a lot of consensus about what needs to be done and what the goals are. And actually, we published it in some ways because we were sick of hearing warm words from the last government backed up by nothing in terms of action and delivery. And I think we're in a completely different space now, and it's really good to see that your role, Sarah, across two departments, which I think will be really helpful. Look, the key points for us are having a clear policy direction which provides certainty and stability for investment in infrastructure and investment in skills. That's something we've lacked across the energy sector for a very long time. This is not a sector, and green industrial growth is not a sector that can be done and completed within one parliamentary term. So we need to lay the long-term foundations, and everybody be clear about that. As Sarah said, skills is a key part of that. I understand, I didn't hear Keir's speech, but I understand he's made an announcement about reform of the apprenticeship levy, which we're really, really pleased about. We've been campaigning for that and for greater flexibility in what I think will now be the growth and skills levy. And that is because not only do we need to get more people straight into these sectors, but we also need to think about people who are changing in mid-career into good jobs, people, some of them who will need to change because they're working in carbon-intensive sectors, and also about expanding the workforce by bringing in, through vocational routes, people who aren't in education, training or employment at the moment, and diversifying that workforce. So I don't expect the levy can do all of those jobs, but it's really positive that it's already moving in that direction. Finance is obviously an issue. Everybody's looking at Great British Energy, the British Jobs Bonus. I think the Treasury have a key role to play here in terms of how they are praising capital investment And I think, again, really encouraging that Rachel's had something to say about that, hopefully moving in the right direction. We make some suggestions in our report, but I think that will be really important because the scale of the challenge that we face and the ambition we have means that we have to look at things a bit differently. So that's important too. And then finally, I think there's a point really about governance. It's great that we've got GBE, it's great that we've got the Office for Clean Energy Jobs, we're going to have Skills England, and there are other bodies being set up. We need to make sure that there is a coherent governance of those and that there's a cross-departmental, cross-government effort, because I think there is, unless it's thought through, and maybe it is already, a potential for barriers and some silos. So we need to get that right as well. And my final introductory point in terms of governance is we're not doing this to people, we're doing it with people. So we need to be involving all key stakeholders, including workers. And we really hope that in the governance of some of these bodies, there will be a role for unions as the voice of workers.
Brilliant, really helpful. And I think that question of how this happens as well as what happens is definitely something that we'll want to pick up in the discussion. I'm going to hand over to George now to give view from IPPR and I suppose maybe to reflect on. I know you've been having loads of conversations about this one way or another over the last few days, so it'd be good to have your reflections on sort of where the debate is at as well as what needs to happen.
Yeah, so this is my last event of conference, so I'm going to keep it simple. I've got 5 minutes and 5 things that I want to say to you about industrial strategy. And actually, the last event I did at the last conference last year was also on industrial strategy. And the first thing is just to recognise how significant the shift is on this topic in the past year, and that we now have a government who are absolutely committed to putting this into practice. And not only that, but for the first time, to my knowledge, in the UK's political history, a time when the Prime Minister, the Chancellor and the Business Secretary are absolutely aligned on that. That was not the case under Greg Clark and Theresa May's industrial strategy when Philip Hammond tried to destroy it at every opportunity. So it really is a unique moment, and I'm so excited to see what Sarah and the team at DBT and in the Treasury and in DESNZ do build over the next months. We heard in Rachel's speech, in the Chancellor's speech yesterday, about that plan of the green paper followed by a white paper. And it's a discussion that IPPR has contributed a huge amount to, whether it's a clear toolkit, an actionable toolkit of policies that can be put into use in the purpose of industrial strategy, or a strategic framework of choosing which sectors the UK should seek to specialise in the future. This is something that we're going to continue looking at. So I just think it's an incredibly exciting moment. Secondly, there's a big question again in Rachel's speech around the Industrial Strategy Council. It's brilliant that's going to be set up or reconstituted and put onto a statutory basis, an institution that can guard against the kind of short-termism that we've seen in industrial strategy in the past. It's also an opportunity to bring capacity into government for this kind of thinking, because the UK government and its track record of industrial policy has not been great. So you need to have a patient approach to building capacity in government to get these decisions right. It's being put onto a statutory basis, and the reason that that commitment was made is to guard against the chopping and changing of industrial strategies in the past. It's easy to make that commitment in opposition because it's a critique of the government, but when you're in government, it really should also act as a rod for Sarah's back, a rod for the Chancellor's back, a rod for the Business Secretary's back, and it should create friction and it should create challenge for some of those decisions in government if it's doing its job properly. And lastly, I think that point that it should also bring in that trade union voice as well as the business voice to get those decisions right.
Yeah.
Thirdly, industrial strategy will create winners and losers in the business community. We don't think that industrial strategy is about picking winners, but if you get the strategy right, some companies that are in the areas that we want to thrive and grow in the British economy will do so, and some will not. And that process of winners and losers will elevate voices in the media discourse who might criticise the government strategy. And I think in an environment in which we don't really have a particularly nuanced debate in the UK about what kind of businesses we want to thrive in the economy, sometimes those voices will be treated as kind of the gospel of the business community, and I think that can be really harmful. Industrial policy will live or die based on the government's ability to kind of create coalitions of winners in the private sector who can champion the strategy and ensure its continued delivery. Fourthly, on that media point, industrial strategy is not a thing that you do and it's done. Like, the white paper publication will be brilliant and I can't wait for it, but it's not job done, because industrial strategy is a process of decision making rather than just a thing that is published and finished. And the government will have to make hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions. Some of those it will get wrong. The game is how you get more right than you get wrong, and how you can create a kind of a government system that gets that right. But that will be really hard, again, in the media climate in which all the successes look like a thriving business, and those successes will be claimed by those businesses themselves, but every failure looks like a government failure. And as soon as a company that's received government support goes up against the wall, that will be portrayed as a story of a failure of industrial strategy. And dealing with that and the winners and losers point will really call for kind of the utmost political skill of the government. And then lastly, it's entirely right that the industrial strategy should seek to support the areas of the British economy which we're currently strong in, but all the historical and international evidence, whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act, whether it's the French government investing in nuclear for the second half of the 20th century, when industrial strategy is done well, it's a long-term bet on the future shape of the economy, not assuming that it's going to be the same shape it is today. And that same challenge is all the more so important for the UK, given we're trying to achieve a green industrial strategy and we're trying to grow our economic activity in the areas which are going to be critical. And Todd will no doubt speak to this, but the question that people want to know of the UK's industrial strategy is, okay, which bits of which green products is the UK going to manufacture? And if we are not able to answer that, then the industrial strategy has not done its job. So really seeking to answer that question clearly, but be grounded in the future growth areas and the transformation of the economy and the areas which are going to be really critical to that future economy, not stuck in the one that we have today.
Brilliant, thank you. And then finally, I'm going to turn to Todd. I've been lucky enough to be part of a few conversations with Todd over the last few days, and it's just so fantastically well timed to have you here at this conference at this moment in the UK, because the US is, a few years ahead of us on this agenda, and I think so many of the experiences and lessons are so relevant. And I suppose I've been particularly struck in what you've said over the past few days in other forums about that bringing together of, industrial policy, climate and environment policy, economic geography and regional growth, and then also good work, skills, the stuff that's really focused on workers. So yeah, really looking forward to hearing a bit more about what you would take from that experience for the UK.
Great, yeah. Thank you so much to IPPR for organizing this and having me over. Just to kind of underline a point that I think a few speakers made, this pivot to industrial strategy and industrial policy really has come quite quickly and developed at a quite impressive speed. I mean, to give an example of that, in 2019 at the Roosevelt Institute, we put out a report called Industrial Policy, What It Is and How to Do It Better, because of the thinking that most of our readers, actually many of them would have no idea what it was, and then the ones that could remember the discussion from the 1980s would think it was terrible, or an example of Solyndra, a little bit more of a recent example. And I think things have moved rather quickly, I think certainly more quickly than we expected in the United States, but really due to sort of three interwoven crises that, of course, you share here in the UK as well. One is the immediate shock of COVID and the shock to supply chains that came with that. Second is sort of the longer running crisis related to various inequalities in the US economy, whether that's sort of the inequality between labor and capital, between regions that were left behind or that were moving ahead, or racial inequalities that we saw sort of with the experience of the Black Lives Matter episodes and police brutality. And then the current and future looking crisis around the climate and what that would mean, after decades of dislocation in the industrial parts of our economy, we were looking at, perhaps a decade of much more displacement, in the US where, 2 million plus workers are dependent on fossil production for one kind or another. So there needed to be an adjustment strategy that was credible with those communities. And so, an early version of that was the Green New Deal proposal that was made in 2019 from Representative Ocasio-Cortez and others. And then that morphed many parts of it into the Build Back Better agenda that the Biden campaign successfully ran and won on. So the three crises, from the three crises, we get the three pillars of sometimes what's called Bidenomics or middle-out economics, which is simultaneously empowering workers to have a voice in the economy, empower in the economy, to promote competition in the corporate sector so that we control prices and control domination of our democracy from some of the big monopolies. And third, addressing those issues through public investment and a renewed sense of sort of public purpose in those dollars. So from those three crises, three pillars, three pieces of legislation, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the infrastructure law. And all three of those constitute a comprehensive industrial strategy for the US economy that's looking to develop over 37 sectors from clean energy, semiconductors, and others that are important inputs to the entirety of the rest of the economy. We achieved, those industrial strategies are structured in a few ways. One, probably the biggest part of it is through the tax credits, which are not sort of your traditional tax credits. They start at 6% of your capital cost an investor can claim for investing in a clean energy sector. That jumps up to 30% if you collaborate with unions and run union apprenticeship programs. And then it can go even still further if you're investing in left behind communities, fossil dependent communities, and others. That's sometimes called the layer cake. So basically you can get between 6 and 70% of your capital cost covered depending on how much you're contributing to the socioeconomic development of the communities that you're investing in. There's also a series of grants and loans that also similarly privilege union workers. And then finally, a trade strategy that looks to protect the vitality of those investments through strategic and selective tariffs to protect the industries that we're investing trillions of dollars of the public money in, through mechanisms like the rapid response mechanism in our trade agreement with Mexico that allows goods to be seized at the border if workers are mistreated in their production. And effectively within days or weeks, they're being reinstated, on the job, which is lifting up labor standards both at home and abroad. And then finally, through a series of sectoral trade agreements with partners that look to prioritize free trade and decarbonized high worker standards production. And maybe I'll come back to that in a second. I think that we've seen the record of that has been very effective in terms of both the macro, micro, and more anecdotal on the ground statistics. We've seen 6 quarters of the very fastest manufacturing construction growth in US history. We have seen for every dollar of the public sector is putting on the line, that's crowding in $6 to $10 of private sector investment. We're seeing the unionization rate in the clean energy sector actually surpass the fossil sector and surpass the unionization rate of the economy at large for the first time in US history. There was many years where the reverse was true. We're seeing major battery facilities and other facilities grow up in parts of the country that have been left behind from globalization, creating new hope for economic development. We're seeing a ton of organizing drive victories from unions that are using the leverage provided by these public dollars to build union power in parts of the country that it had long been thought legally and politically impossible to do so due to states that have anti-union laws on the books. And then I think politically it's been a success in the sense that we've had, in the 2022 midterm elections, we have our congressional elections every 2 years. The incumbent party, President Biden's party, had one of the best midterm performances in 200 plus years of US history. So they've been politically rewarded, and the polls kind of, I think, show that as well. An important lesson, I think, for labor as they think about how to structure this. I'll just close on this, that I think that the next 2-year window is a window of a lot of opportunity potentially for the US, the UK, and us together. I think if we have some favorable election outcomes in the United States, there will be this window. And as I said, we sort of have the midterms every 2 years, so we sort of think in 2-year terms. If there's unified government, there's going to be an opportunity to get a lot done on that collaborative agenda, including through looking at ways that we can be collaborating with some of the new, National Wealth Fund and other institutions that are getting set up, looking for sort of sectoral trade agreements that do reward high road, decarbonized practices. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity there, and look forward to answer any questions or the discussion ahead. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Really, I think kind of inspiring to see what's possible and what can be done in really quite a short period of time, exactly as you say. So we've got about half an hour for questions and discussion. I think I will take questions in groups of 3 and then ask the panel to kind of come back on some or all of them, and then we'll try and, if I can just ask, I can already see loads of hands going on, so please try and keep your questions brief so that we can get a maximum number in. So there were 2 in the front row here, if we don't mind coming here to start with. This side of the room seems much less keen to ask questions.
Yazela Farmer, Chief Executive of BEMA. We represent manufacturers of electrical products in the UK. I really welcome the comments on winners and losers, and also the reference to the fact it's not just going to be reliant on growth of manufacturing in the UK. We've got to have international growth of that supply chain as well. Is a question for Sarah. How are you wanting to engage with industry to carefully assess those winners and losers, and how can we, the industry, help you do that? And I say that with the context of clean energy specifically as a supply chain that we know the volumes globally are going to be really unprecedented, and it's a really complex analysis of that supply chain, and it sounds like you're working at speed.
Great.
Thank you. My name's Miranda Barker. I'm the Chief Executive of East Lancashire Chamber of Commerce, and we run a low-carbon innovation agency called Redcat. We know that there's a huge opportunity in the green industrial manufacturing potential sector. If you talk to Chris Stark and Chris Skidmore and Nigel Topping, they're all saying great opportunity, but we're stood flat-footed on the starting line. We've got great examples of projects around the UK where it's showing a 1-to-8 return in terms of pounds in, pounds out. But we need an ambitious industrial strategy, preferably an ambitious output-focused industrial strategy that concentrates on achieving commercialisation, driving real scale-up in the UK, not elsewhere, and looking for those jobs to be created. And if we have an output-focused industrial strategy, that will be really a great opportunity. What's the chances of that? Thank you.
Great. I'll take one more question. So yeah, just on the aisle here.
Hi, I'm Sam Lux, councillor from Nottingham, focusing on carbon reduction. I'm wondering what the panel thinks about how we make sure that small businesses aren't left behind. Small businesses, small and medium businesses account for 30% of all UK emissions, and we know that what we need for them to decarbonise is firstly adequate and government-backed information for them to act upon. Secondly, tailored advice, so they get auditing to make sure that they know exactly where their emissions are coming from and what they need to do. And finally, sufficient funding to follow up on those recommendations. Currently, none of that is in place, and I'm sure the government's going to get round to it, but I'd be really interested to understand how and when.
Great, thank you. Brilliant question. So one on engagement with industry around winners and losers, one on the kind of level of ambition for an output-based strategy, and then really good question about SMEs. Was it Sarah? Do you want to start?
No, happy to. So how we engage with industry, obviously there'll be the Industrial Strategy Council, which sort of, as has been outlined, sort of sets that kind of non-political long-term evidence base, but there will be lots of engagement with industry, and there will be lots of engagement with layers of devolution as well, and that's really important. So it's not just industry, but it's like, how are our mayors, our local authorities, all of the different, and the nations, how are we all speaking together? And there is a lot of work going on at the moment looking at how we do this most effectively. In the meantime, what I'm saying to people is, do tell me things, and let's have conversations, and I'm talking to as many people as I possibly can, but the structures need to cover place as well as industry, and we need to make sure we get that right, as well as obviously trade unions, who will be absolutely at the heart of all of this as well. On the kind of outward focused industrial strategy, it's really interesting, and I'd like to hear the panel's views on how you measure success of an industrial strategy, because there's place, there's jobs, there's skills, there's basic kind of economic metrics, you know, and there's also, I think, a really important political success measure, which is that people know what it is, they understand, and they think it's a good thing, and they can understand and see their communities, you know, being better as a result. So there's all kinds of metrics, and how you do that, it obviously has to be outward facing, and it has to be something that you can't just announce it and then there you go, we've kind of done it and that's the end of it. It's got to be outcome focused, but what those outcomes are, it's quite an interesting question. And in terms of, shall I answer all three? Is that,
but by all means.
No. Sorry, I was just on a roll. I'll do it quickly, other people can answer it better. But small business is so important, and I'm responsible for this kind of area, and I think there's going to be a small business strategy within DBT, and you know, it's one of the 4 kind of pillars of what Johnny Reynolds is doing. And within DESNES, there's a sort of small stream of work where we support small businesses to decarbonise. There's also a stream of work in Department of Science and Innovation that helps small businesses sort of think about digitisation and all of that. And there's pots of money. There's a pot of money for small business manufacturing, small businesses, to help them as well. So I think there's quite a lot of work to be done to make it as easy as possible for small businesses to access the support that there will be, and make sure they're coming on this journey as well, because people don't have the time or the inclination or the headspace to worry about these things, and we need to make it as easy as we possibly can. And it's a really good point.
Great, thank you. Sue, do you want to come back on any of those?
Yes, I do, please. Look, I agree, Miranda, we need an ambitious industrial strategy. And although we're never going to make everything in the UK, I do think strengthening our supply chains and growing our supply chains is going to be a really important part of that. Because in terms of output measures, that will help in terms of jobs, not just numbers of jobs, but hopefully good quality of jobs as well. It should help with economic growth. We know what the challenge is with economic growth and productivity at the moment, and a lot of these will be jobs in highly productive sectors. I think national security, energy security is an important factor here as well. And we mustn't forget the people in this and communities and the difference that this can make to communities. An ambitious industrial strategy has to be a strategy for the whole of the UK, and it has to bring jobs and growth to some of those left behind communities. And actually, in terms of the politics of it, that is going to be really important.
Great, thank you. Can I come to you, Todd? I'd be really interested to hear on this kind of how do you measure success, and how do you, I suppose, measure it, use that to learn, and then communicate that?
I'll address that. I wanted to mention a few things on the small business issue and the competition issue. I think that we've addressed this, as I mentioned, in a number of ways in the United States, that one of those pillars of middle-out economics is increasing competition in markets, and we're doing that in a few ways. One is that there are pluses and minuses of using tax credits, as George and I and others have been discussing this week. There's a variety of reasons I can get into if people are interested of why we use that approach, but I think one of the consequences is that it helps address this picking winners, not picking winners issue, which is that every small business in the United States has experience filling out their taxes. They can use systems that they already know how to use, that they don't need to hire lawyers or additional accountants to access to be able to get those deductions and claim those credits. And so we're seeing small businesses and smaller businesses take that up. We're also seeing, the tax credits give 10% incentive for using local supply chains. So that's also supporting smaller businesses that make inputs into clean energy products. And I think that we're also using the various competition and antitrust tools we have to also encourage competition in markets, and that's from meat packing to aerospace and everything sort of in between. I mean, I think one thing that's helped out a lot of small businesses is just taking over the monopoly, addressing the monopoly power of companies like Amazon that, exploit small vendors that use their platforms, to sell their products. So I think all of that's kind of helping. I think having industrial strategy and competition policy go hand in hand is a good way to sort of avoid, I think, the excesses of either, having them both kind of work together. On sort of the broader question of metrics, I think we mentioned some of those. I mean, certainly that your industrial strategy is showing up in your macro indicators is good and reassuring. I think some of these evidences of we've had record numbers of small business starts in the last year, last couple of years. So those are certainly encouraging as well. But then I think some of these other indicators that you will probably only see over time as we see communities transform, number of union organizations built, and those kinds of things will also be what we're looking for over the long term.
Great. George, you want to come in?
Yeah, just picking up on a few other points there. And it speaks to the two questions on the front row around output and supply chains, that in that bit of work I mentioned earlier about how if the UK wants to do something like the Inflation Reduction Act, we can't do everything, so how do you pick what you do? I think that's a really critical question. And what we looked into green manufacturing supply chains specifically and mapped those, so it's not just an end product like a EV, but all the way back up the supply chain. Firstly, some of the headlines of that research is very promising, that in 1/3 of those green supply chains, green products we identified, the UK already has comparative advantage today. So if people ask me, how can we possibly compete with the US or China? The answer is we already are competitive. But you are right that mapping those supply chains can be very hard, but is essentially what the hard thing that has to happen in government. I went to a conference last year where there was a expert on the Chinese industrial strategy, and he had a slide which had something like 100 different products, like parts down to 10 micrometer microspheres, like that level of specificity, and they just ticked off about half of them. And they're like, yeah, we've just repatriated manufacturing of all those products to China now, and they're just going through them one by one. And I think that level of granularity of thinking is what is needed to get this right. So it's like joining up that really big political rhetoric that you heard from the Chancellor yesterday of like, we're going to have a EV auto hotspot in the West Mids, right down to like, okay, but which bits of them are going to be manufactured and where is going to be really critical. And focusing on the output of those is basically how I would think about that. And in terms of the metrics, or how would we measure success, absolutely what Todd says, thinking about investment and levels of investment in the economy, we should be seeing those improve. We should be seeing the numbers of green products that we have comparative advantage in increasing as well. People have their opinions on comparative advantage, lovers and haters. We can take it up after the discussion. Not now, please. Nobody wants that discussion. But that should be increasing. And I think most critically, one of the reasons why we think focusing on green manufacturing is so important, and there is a whole other questions around services in the economy too, but the UK has suffered exceptional decline in its manufacturing specialisation. If you ask what makes a developed economy, it's not that they've actually picked two things they're going to be really good at. It's the opposite. It's they have a really broad base, economic base, where they are strong at lots of different things and are able to combine those in different ways that makes for a thriving, dynamic, developed economy. In manufacturing specialisation, the UK is one of the only countries in the G7 where that has declined over the past 20 years, and we are the only country that's declined by more than 10%. So if you look at other countries in the G7, they've all deindustrialised, so manufacturing as a percent of GDP has reduced, but the numbers of things that they're good at making have all basically remained the same, apart from us, and we've absolutely cratered. So we've lost 1/3 of that specialisation over the past 30 years. If we're going to stand any chance of reaping the economic benefits of the transition to net zero, that line has got to go in the opposite direction.
Great. Another round of questions. And having challenged this side of the room, I feel like I now need to look to my right. So front row here, two in the front row.
Thank you. Paul McNerney, Exec Director for Laing O'Rourke. We're one of the UK's largest construction engineering organisations. we really welcome this conversation. It's fantastic to see an industrial strategy being put in place, and we're particularly excited around the whole concept of mission-led. I think the point I'd just like to make, and it will conclude with a question, which is a point around the alignment of interests, and I think the powered up benefit we get from bringing different missions together. So our industry, construction, is a very traditional industry. It's had a very poor safety record over the years, and it suffers from low productivity and poor innovation uptake. However, our organisation and others have invested very heavily in advanced manufacturing and new techniques. And I think there's an opportunity here when we talk about skills to actually change the type of work that we're asking people to do in service of this mission, such that we start dealing with some of the issues that Lord Darcy wrote last week around ensuring that people aren't just kept healthy at work, but their health is actually improved, and people therefore have long careers and then don't suffer ill health into retirement and post-career. And suddenly we start getting a leverage between delivering on the green mission, but also making sure that we're taking people away from NHS requirements. So the question I'd like to ask is, we'd love to understand what are the forums in which public and private can come together and really understand how do we get these missions to join up, and how do we start to get these layers of benefit as a result.
Great, and then next to you.
Thank you. Andrew LaBelle, Citibank. We understand and support the goals and ambitions of Great British Energy. I would just like to hear more on how Great British Energy intends on achieving those goals and ambitions. And what I mean by that is, will Great British Energy take minority equity stakes in projects or companies? Will it be majority stakes? Could Great British Energy be a national developer of energy, green energy? What will be the role of Great British Energy compared to, let's say, the UK Infrastructure Bank? And then sort of pivoting to contrast to the US experience, I think this creation of national energy champions is something we see, we'll see in the UK, we see in Europe, we see in other countries. In contrast, I think the US has chosen very much like a different path using tax credits and other such financial tools. We'd love to hear why the US chose this different strategy. Yeah.
Great. And then there was a gentleman here on the aisle. Yeah. Just wait for the mic, sorry.
Lawrence Roberts, long retired head teacher and canvasser in the 1945 general election. That's how old I am. Could I just ask the simple question, if we have an unfavourable outcome, however you identify that, of the American election, what effect do you think it will have on the various strategies you've outlined?
If we had an unfavourable outcome?
Yeah.
However you identify.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to start with Todd, if that's okay, because there were a couple of specific questions. So somebody's taken you up on your offer to talk about why the tax credits approach.
Yes.
So let's do that. And I think we know what you think the unfavourable outcome would be in the US election, but reflections on what that might mean here would be
Surprising
great.
turn for the Roosevelt Institute.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think the one-word answer to why the U.S. has no sovereign wealth fund is the Senate of the U.S., the U.S. Senate. Basically, the reality was there was a much broader agenda that Biden campaigned on that included things like that would have looked like a version of a sovereign wealth fund. And at the end of the day, they had a 50-50 Senate. And there's just a lot of procedural limitations to what can get through a 50-50 Senate. And it ended up the tax credits were what we were able procedurally to get through. I think that one of the things you'll see to have both sort of a favorable and unfavorable take on the election, I think if there's a favorable outcome, one of the differences that we've seen with Kamala Harris is she's much less of an institutionalist when it comes to some of these procedural questions that sort of set the US apart from other major democracies, that make it much less democratic, frankly, than a lot of other democracies. I think that we'll see more of that original agenda get through because she's willing to sort of change some of the procedures that the US Senate follows. So I think that would be one among the outcomes that we would see in a favorable outcome. I think, if Trump were elected, I think some parts of this agenda go forward. It was designed, the Inflation Reduction Act was designed to resolve the United States' longstanding climate credibility problem on the international stage. which I think sometimes is surprising to people because it sort of seems like it's very focused inward into the local supply chains and things like that. The number one priority of the Democratic Party was to make sure that even in a country where one party is quite close to the fossil fuel industry and is denying of climate change, that it would be possible to have an industrial strategy that would last, basically by creating a lot of jobs and economic development benefits in red states and red districts. So I think that we're going to see continuity with the things that are already on the books. And then I think that there's also, actually the number one proponent, one of them in the US Senate of a sovereign wealth fund for the United States is Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance. So there's between that, and I think also on things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms, even with a Republican, you would I think find willing partners for partnership.
Great. Sarah, I wonder whether you could speak to, there's obviously a huge amount of appetite for this kind of public-private conversation in the context of missions. I just wonder whether you could say a bit about that in particular.
Yes, I mean, I don't have a sort of structured answer in the sense of how these things work. There are some structures within government that exist, like the Construction Leadership Council is a kind of body that exists already and seems to work quite well, so we want to carry on with it. So we're not in the business of sort of ripping up everything that went before, but the industrial strategy, when it's announced next year, will have to have layers of engagement that work beneath the Industrial Strategy Council, as I was talking about before, and we just need to work through what those are so that we have a kind of agile, nimble system where people can be feeding in information all the time.
I don't know whether, Sue, whether you want to speak to this as well in terms of this kind of new mission approach to government, and particularly picking up your point about the opportunities for unions and workers and working people to engage in those conversations, and kind of what your hopes and expectations are.
Well, we hope to be fully involved in the conversations. Take GBE, as that's been mentioned, as an example of that. Look, this is, I think lots of people have got opinions about GBE and how it's going to actually operate. It's going to be a great example of public and private and stakeholder engagement. In our view, it ought to focus on first-of-a-kind investments and investments where we need to make progress really quickly. But I think what GBE will bring to this as well is the government's procurement. We've seen government use procurement in the US very effectively, and I hope that we'll see that through GBE as well, and that the governance of that will be a rounded partnership governance. And we can use that from our point of view to ensure that we're creating good jobs in the right places as well. And your point about the changing world of work, of course, we have to prepare people for that. And that's where an industrial strategy linked to it, skills strategy, will be absolutely crucial, because it must happen. But how we get there, what the journey looks like for individuals and groups of people, is going to be absolutely crucial. And I think what Labour is building is a more supportive framework, and I think it's much more open to engagement, to listening, experience, and working with various stakeholders.
George, do you have any burning points, or should I go out for another round?
Just very quickly on the GB Energy question, I think being very specific about what it does is really important. We've got a piece of work coming up later on this year on the kind of institutional design of that, both for today and beyond the 2030 mission, because that's only 5 years away, and actually we need to be thinking about what it does in the longer term. But I think the most important thing for that is that it doesn't just replicate a private sector act, or otherwise what was the point of setting it up? Mm-hmm. It has to be doing something additional that is not already being delivered by the institutional investors that already exist. And in my view, taking either majority or minority stakes in projects with lower profitability but still profitable is probably the best route. It would allow it to recycle those profits into future investments. And I think that's partly a consequence of the capitalisation, what might limit it taking a significant kind of like entire ownership stake. And then I think the tie-up with, for example, the Crown Estate is really interesting and takes it into an interesting space of public or kind of semi-publicly owned assets, land, and what you can do in that space.
Great. Right, more questions. Yes, gentleman just here.
Hi, this is a really great panel. Thank you, everybody. My question is about innovation in the industrial strategy, specifically higher education, from the University of Nottingham. We're trying to decarbonize heavy transport. Nesta put out a report that said there are a few places where geographically across the UK that are seeing higher than average private investment in R&D and lower than average public investment in R&D. And so there's an implication there that maybe public investment could be better leveraged and crowd in private funding in other places. So I'm wondering if the government would consider readdressing how that geographic spread of investment is allocated.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you. There was a question right at the back over there, yeah.
Hello, Leanne Farrer from SCI. We're a global network of innovators. I'd argue that the UK has the potential to be very competitive across a broad range of sectors when it comes to creation of new low-carbon technology, etc. But the one thing that all the sectors have in common is that innovation can quite often take a long time. So how do we provide the confidence in the UK long-term to make sure that we can get that long-term investment for them?
Great, and then there was somebody right on the edge over there. Yeah, sorry, the other side. Sorry, I'm making you run around the room.
Thank you. Charlie Hicks from Oxfordshire County Council. I've heard a lot in conference about how health spend can be in service to the economy mission, and how health spend,
Health.
but the same applies to lots of different policy areas, how it can be in service to the mission economy. Reversing that, how might the industrial strategy be in service of some of the less obvious missions, health, safe streets, and opportunities?
Great question. So a bit of an innovation theme in the first tier about the crowding in of private investment and the geographical spread of public and private investment across the country, timescales and confidence, and then kind of reversing the argument about industrial strategy feeding into some of the other missions. I don't know who wants to start.
I'm happy to go, yeah. On the first two around kind of innovation and where you put investment and the long-termism, again, going back to that research we did on supply chains, we were trying to work out the areas where we think that we have best potential for specialization is not based on what we do today. It's based on what we can do tomorrow. And taking examples like the University of Sheffield partnership with the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, building that in Sheffield, Rotherham, built on the kind of skills in the supply chains that already existed in Sheffield in that place, so very community-based and specific, but also drawing in the innovation that existed within the university. That has been an amazing success story that's crowded in private sector investment, with Boeing opening their first European factory in there, and they are able to make parts of jets cheaper in Sheffield than they can in Mexico, because of the higher labour productivity in the area. So building on those is critical. Easier said than done, right? The question is, how do you identify what a cluster like that looks like to build on it? And that's what we've tried to do with building a bit of a metrics base. And we were able to dive into that data and in the strategic sectors which we think the UK should focus on, of heat pumps, wind and green transport, map those on a national basis. The thing that's striking about that is it is a national picture. The hotspots are across the whole country, not just London and the South East, which adds to the strategic case for focusing on this as a levelling up mission. But how do you build in the kind of long-term confidence? It's about, I think, setting that strategy and sticking to it. And also recognising that, and the new government have acknowledged this throughout, that the way that you crowd in private sector investment and you drive investment is not through kind of tax cuts and deregulation, but actively working to incentivize what actually drives business investment, which is that businesses expect they can make a future profit or there's a growth sector. And that is what has been lacking for so long in UK industrial strategy, of a sense of direction and vision. And the chopping and changing of policy has harmed the state's ability to give a signal of what direction it envisages the UK economy travelling in for too long.
I wonder, Sue, whether I could bring you in on this question of missions and how industrial strategy can kind of serve wider, and it's a very similar point to the one that was made about health, so how kind of industrial strategy and better work can feed into some of those wider aspirations and missions that the government has set out.
I think I'd just like to give an example of a conversation I was involved in yesterday with the Satellite Applications Catapult, which is A lot of R&D going on there. Some of it is publicly funded. But when you look at the applications from that innovation, it's in environment, it's in transport, it's in health because of the tracking that it's able to do. And so I think a mission-led approach is really important. But sometimes the best innovation comes from, if you like, pure R&D as well. And so I think there is a case for looking at what the right balance is there between publicly and privately funded R&D, because the truth of the matter is we don't know the answer to everything at the moment, and some of the things that we rely on today have come from that pure R&D, and application of satellite technology is a great example of that.
Sarah, I don't know whether you want to come in on...
I mean, I guess, the point of the industrial strategy in many ways is to make sure people have good jobs and good opportunities, and so the kind of missions around opportunity is the other side of the coin of creating the jobs and the industries of the future that people can thrive within. So if we get the skills mix right, and if we get if Skills England and the apprenticeship levy and the technical excellence colleges all work together, people will have better opportunities, be able to transition from one job to another, be able to live more fulfilled lives, and we'll be paying them better, and that will help with our NHS mission and our education mission. It's hard. I was a civil servant in 2008 to the end of 2012 on the Olympics, and Tessa Jow was my boss, and then Jeremy Hunt. And Tessa Jow used to want to she's the most brilliant woman ever, but she did want to fix everything through the Olympics. So she would come and she'd say, right, how are we going to fix knife crime through the power of the Olympics? And we go, I don't know. We're going to have a structure which is clear about what we can do and what we can't do, and not try and sort of do absolutely everything, whilst at the same time, I think there are absolute synergies between the missions, and they do have to work together.
I just wondered whether you could pick up on the geography point a bit, because you mentioned that part of the way that's worked in the US has been incentivizing and focusing on areas that have been left behind, but kind of how that fits then with this sort of long-term picking winners, identifying areas of comparative advantage. Can you just talk a little bit about how that's worked in practice in the US?
Yeah, I mean, so some of it that I mentioned already was that, the tax credits under the production tax credit and investment tax credit become more generous if you're investing in communities that have been reliant on fossil fuels for their employment and local budgetary base, tax revenue base. Also, low-income communities, and we're sort of seeing, I believe, something like 75–80% of the investments are going into below average income communities and districts around the country. So it's and heavily disproportionately in formerly fossil fuel dependent districts. So I mean, I think that's one of the ways that we're achieving it. But then I think some of the other parts that have gotten a little bit less notice and a little bit less reporting are using regional hubs for innovation around hydrogen, around skill development. There's, I think, between different federal agencies, there's something like a couple of dozen different regional hubs that are focused on areas that have had historic manufacturing capacity. And these are some of the places that had been left behind and hard hit by the China shock. But they still have a lot of the footprint of factories. They have workers that have experience historically in working in these sectors. And so that's where you're starting to see sort of a new/old geography of production in the U.S. that corresponds to some of the places that had previously been strong.
Great. I'm going to take two very quick questions. Lady just there, and then right at the back, yep. And then I'm going to ask the panel to respond to those questions and make any final concluding remarks.
Hi, I'm Catherine Green from High Knot. Would a new blue hydrogen industry based on imported fossil fuel gas be secure, affordable and sustainable?
Great. Short question. Love it. Right at the back over there. Yep.
Thanks. Katie from Biofuel Watch. You talk about winners and losers. Is there anything in place to ensure that the winners are the genuinely low carbon kind of enterprises? I'm thinking with my Biofuel Watch hat on of Drax, which is currently receiving millions in supposed renewable energy subsidies, but it's the biggest carbon emitter in the UK. How can is there going to be checks and balances in place to ensure that the winners are those that are deserving of, you know, green support?
Great, thank you. Two really focused questions. So I'm going to ask the panel to speak in the order that they spoke in to start with, and just as I pick up those two questions, but then if you've got any final reflections from the discussion, do share those as well.
Blue hydrogen imports, was that the first question?
Yeah.
I think the kind of jury's slightly out at the moment, and in terms of imports, we're focusing in terms of government funding, and this was sort of a process that was set up, to be fair, by the previous government. The initial funding is about producing hydrogen here in the UK and trying to get to a point where we create the conditions that we can have a market here that we can potentially export. So we can, whereas bringing it in is, but maybe we're misunderstanding the question. Oh, bringing gas in and then, yeah. So it's early days. The first round, as I say, of hydrogen funding is going to be, hopefully, fingers crossed, touch wood, everything, announced soon. And that is kind of based on sort of a certain number of projects. There is huge other potential for all kinds of different things to do with hydrogen. And, you know, we're now looking as a new government at, like, actually, what do we think about hydrogen? What should our strategy be? And where should it go? So looking at that sort of keenly. On the carbon question, well, obviously we have our target to have clean energy by 2030 and then decarbonise by 2050, and we have our, you know, we have the progress that we know we have to map to get towards that, and we have the Climate Change Commission making sure that we make that progress. So everything that we do in terms of the industrial strategy has to be with a mind to making sure we're delivering, you know, zero carbon, and we need to make sure the levers in the industrial strategy that we use incentivise the right behaviours, and that's, you know, that's what we want to do.
Great, thank you. Sue.
So on the hydrogen issue, there's lots of debate about this at the moment, and I'm not going to second guess that debate. In relation to supporting genuinely low carbon activities, I get that absolutely, but what I would say is for our low carbon future, we are going to need things like steel and cement, and what we shouldn't do is engage in offshoring the carbon emissions. It is important that we have those foundation industries as well for our low carbon future. Just in terms of where we go next, look, I think there was tremendous excitement which created expectation pre-election about what Labour would do. I think you've moved remarkably quickly in some ways, but I think everybody's going to be looking between now and the end of the year about what this is all going to mean in practice. And I think there's a really difficult but important job to ensure that you've set the long-term framework, the long-term sustainable framework, at the same time as having to be able to demonstrate some quick changes that are beneficial to communities, because people are looking for that. And I think it's a difficult balance to have, but it's a good problem to have, and I think lots of people want to work with you to achieve that. But what everybody is impatient for is to see delivery.
Great. George?
The two questions I think have kind of been adequately answered, but I think, in my view, the answer is to really navigating both challenges of blue hydrogen or biofuels is that all of the strategy has to be entirely aligned with our net zero goals and the clear CCC pathway to achieving those. And another international lesson of industrial policy is if you need to put in place a subsidy as a stopgap, that you also need to know how to withdraw that subsidy later on as well, and that can be very politically challenging. So I guess that applies to the Drax point, in my view. In terms of closing remarks, I think that it's an incredible opportunity for Sarah and the team, and I'm incredibly enthusiastic about what an industrial strategy can achieve in terms of transforming the economy, frankly, just because we haven't tried very hard anymore, and our economy is not doing too well. I don't know if you've noticed, but I think it's time that we tried. And that manufacturing decline that I spoke about, the decline of our specialisation, the fact that people have described the UK economy as a submerging economy rather than a developed economy, is a sign that it's time, as the Chancellor said, that we care about what gets made and where. And if an industrial strategy really grapples with that question and gets it right, it can transform the British economy, it can create prosperity across the country, it can reduce inequality and unfairness in the economy, and it can set us on a path towards not just shifting the economy towards net zero, but capturing the economic return on that as well. So I'm really excited.
Great. And last word to you, Todd.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that we've had so many good interventions and questions about the mechanics of how to do industrial policy, and I think it's useful to kind of just remind ourselves the ultimate why of why we're doing this. And I think that it really is to try to save the planet and save a home for our children and grandchildren. And I think that there's a variety of ways that industrial strategy can better support that going into the future. One of the ways that we're doing it in the U.S. is moving our tax credit system to be technology neutral, so that it's more it rewards the deepest emissions cuts rather than just sort of picking one or another winner technology. So I think that will be something that will be helpful, and that's why we call the Inflation Reduction Act a climate bill rather than just a clean energy bill. It really is targeted towards trying to have the maximum contribution as it can to our Paris climate commitments. So I think that's one way to make this work. But as I said, sort of encourage everybody to look for opportunities in the next 2 years for strong US and UK alliances on these questions. I think there's a lot of good we can do.
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you. That's been an incredibly optimistic and constructive discussion. So thank you all for brilliant questions. Particular thanks to our panellists for giving such kind of diverse and interesting contributions. And thank you again to Prospect for supporting this event and partnering with us. I'm going to ask you to thank our panel properly in a second, but before I do, I feel like a very bad host in saying this, but we've got another event in this room after this one, which is ticketed. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask people to reasonably swiftly exit the room. Do continue your conversations outside in the vestibule, down the steps, but the team's got to turn the room around for security purposes. But on that, sorry to be slightly unfriendly note, please do join me in thanking our panel.